Hello and welcome to Talking Aussie Books, a weekly podcast bringing readers and writers of Australian fiction together. I'm Claudine Tinellis. As an avid reader and passionate advocate for Australian fiction, I make it my mission to spotlight local talent. So if you're looking for your next read or simply want to learn more about the Australian literary scene, this podcast is for you. Grab yourself a cuppa, sit back and relax. Close to a year ago, I attended the Bad Sydney Crime Festival and had the pleasure of meeting Melbourne-based author Lyn Yeowart. At the time, Lyn's debut novel, The Silent Listener, had just been released by Penguin, and she appeared on a panel at the festival alongside two other fabulous crime writers, Lorraine Peck and Nicola Moriarty. A fascinating panel that saw each of the authors read an extract of their respective novels. Lyn read an extract from the prologue of her novel, in which a woman has just found her terminally ill father dead in his bed. What followed was something I would never forget. The words Lyn recited that day are imprinted on my brain. Words that come from a place loosely based on Lyn's childhood experiences and explode on the pages of this novel to form an unforgettable, gripping and dark story which moved me deeply. Set in rural Victoria and moving back and forth between the 1940s, 1960s and 1980s, The Silent Listener is a brilliantly crafted novel about secrets and lies and the lengths the small community will go to protect a monster, delivering a shocking twist that I absolutely didn't see coming. I can see why it was shortlisted for the 2022 Danger Prize, 2 Davitt Awards, and also the winner of the 2022 Indie Book Award for Best Debut Fiction. And so I'm delighted to have the chance to speak with Lyn about this incredible novel on the podcast today. Welcome, Lyn.
Thank you, Claudine. Thank you very much. I am equally delighted to be talking to you.
If listeners are in any doubt about how I feel about this novel, oh my, it was just incredible. Reading it, I was in complete awe of the way in which you not only handled a dark and difficult subject matter, but multiple timelines and points of view. An incredible achievement, Lyn, particularly as it is your debut. How long was this story cooking before you actually started writing it?
Well, it's been cooking since, I guess, my childhood, or perhaps maybe my late teens and early 20s, when I was looking back at my childhood and thinking about it and looking at other people around me who clearly didn't have that sort of childhood. And I guess I began some serious reflection, which maybe other people maybe don't need to do when they're, in their late teenage years or early 20s. I don't know. So I think it's been cooking for a long time. But it also did take a very, very long time to write, partly because I guess as a result of my childhood, I did not have a lot of self-confidence. And I think I can say, I always harboured a desire to be a writer, always totally in love with books and reading and language and words and, even punctuation and grammar, everything about writing I absolutely love. But I don't think I ever thought that I would be a writer, because for me, writers were pretty much semi-demigods. And I just didn't think that I would ever be good enough to write something that actually could be published. But I was kind of driven to write because I do love language so much. But I probably didn't start writing it. This is a weird thing, because I sometimes think people must think, oh my God, she's pathetic. But anyway, I think I started writing it when I was in my 40s, but I didn't think I was writing a book. I was just writing. And then I met in my day job, I was contracting and doing what's called technical writing. And I met a guy called Ken Chow, who's a poet and also a technical writer. And we started talking about other writing that we do. And we said, oh, yeah, this is great. We should share. We should, bring into work some of our other writing. And I thought, oh, God, why am I don't know. I don't know if I want to do this. But I was somehow brave enough to do it. And then I read his poetry and I thought, oh my God, he's just in a completely different league to me. And I'm really embarrassed that I've given him what I gave him. Anyway, he said, oh my God, this is amazing. So we were both awed by each other's writing, which was really nice. And I think just that little bit of feedback that he gave me, thought, maybe I'll keep going. Anyway, at some point I'd written lots of, I'm just going to say scenes, So they're just little short stories. They're probably not even really a story, just stuff, for want of a better way of saying it. And then, I don't know, at some point I thought, yeah, I need to put these together and actually write a novel. So it was a long time coming.
So was there any particular event that made you finally sit down and start writing this story?
You know, I keep coming back to that comment, that first comment from Ken, where he said that, you know, he really liked what I wrote and wanted to read more. That was probably the thing. I want to read more, bring me more. A few years later, I went and did a postgraduate diploma in creative writing at Melbourne Uni, and I had some really good feedback there from various lecturers. And then I waited, I think, a couple of years, and then I went and did a master's at Melbourne Uni as well. And there are a couple of people there, very well-known authors. So I'll mention them too, Arnold Zabel and Tony Birch, who both really liked what I had written, or, you know, various parts that they read. And I think their encouragement and very positive feedback made me think, yeah, maybe I can do this. And then there were people like, you know, I met JP Pomare in a novel writing masterclass run by Anthony Yark in Melbourne. Josh is a bit of a workaholic and or a writerholic, and he was well into his first book, Call Me Evie, when we met. And his focus on, yeah, I'm going to do this and I know what I'm doing. And he just, you know, when his book came out, I thought, right, okay, I know I've actually got to sit here, got to sit at this desk and put in hours and hours and hours and hours of work. And that's what I started doing. So, you know, I was doing things like learning Spanish, and I stopped my Spanish lessons. And anyone who comes and looks at my house and my garden knows I don't spend a lot of time there, right? And so it really is that, you know, get your bum on the seat and just focus. So probably, I don't know whether I answered your question or not.
So for listeners who haven't read your book yet, I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about the story.
Okay, so the story centres on Joy in two time frames. In the 1960s, when she's about 12 and looking forward to going to high school. So she's just finished last year at primary school. So that time era is set sort of in the 6 to 7 weeks of the summer holidays in the 1960s over Christmas. And then when she comes back to the farm in 1983 to look after her father, who's dying, and when she gets there, she's surprised to see her sister there, and together they plot their revenge, because in the 1960s chapters, it becomes obvious that their father is a monster, and he rules his house with fear and emotional and physical punishments, and his children have a very difficult childhood, to say the least. Yeah, so they plot their revenge. And then the 1940s chapters, which were never going to be there, but a few early readers, like people in the masterclass that I went to and so on, they kept saying, but how did this family get to be like this? How did the parents get to be like this? So I thought, okay, I can introduce chapters that explain what happened before the 1960s. And that was interesting because I thought, you know, I don't want to drown people in too much detail. So I tried to keep those chapters really, really short. And then as the story developed in my mind and on the page, on the screen, I realised that some of what happened in the 40s or in that relationship between the parents could also be quite significant in the 60s, not just to give background, but to actually set up a couple of key events that really, I guess, explode later on in the 60s and 80s chapters. Yeah, I didn't initially have 3 timelines. In fact, initially I only had 1 timeline, but it became very obvious that I started initially, well, I guess some of those very early sort of vignette pieces were set in the 60s, but when I started the novel, I thought, right, I'm going to write a novel. I think I actually started in the 80s chapters. It was going to be Joy, and it was going to be after the father had died, and it was going to be her sort of, I guess, doing this existential reflection on her life, but it morphed into this sort of psychological thriller with crime elements in it, and I enjoyed writing that a bit more. And we were talking about this before, maybe readers enjoy reading that a bit more too.
Although I've alluded to the fact that this is quite a dark story, and for a great portion of the story, I found myself holding my breath, waiting for the next incident. It's like the entire Henderson family were holding their breath or taking the smallest or shallowest of breaths, afraid that if they made the slightest disturbance, they would set off the time bomb that was George Henderson. It was honestly quite terrifying the way you managed to convey this tremendous sense of dread. But having said that, the narrative is not without its lighter moments. Can you tell me a little bit more about that?
Yeah, I love the light moments. I have to tell you. So at one point I had this. I don't even know where this idea came from, but I decided that Joy would have synesthesia, which means, and a rare form of synesthesia. She sees images in her head when she hears certain words, or either hears them or sees them. And I really, really enjoyed writing that element of it, and her getting encouragement from the mother of a friend of hers to write down these words and these images that she loved. And so I really enjoyed doing that because I loved coming up with definitions. And I'm just going to say they're really easy for me to come up with. And a lot of people have said to me that they don't think like this, but every single definition sounded exactly perfect for them. So that was really interesting. So there's that, which is a slightly lighter side. And the other part which I enjoyed writing was the next door neighbour, who mispronounces a lot of words, but also is clearly a very kind man, and he's kind to Joy in it so far as he can be, given a whole lot of limitations and, I guess, societal and gender-based and age-based and all that sort of stuff, restrictions and so on. And the friend Felicity that Joy has, I really enjoyed writing about their friendship and about her family, who welcome her and are exuberant and love life. And so that was really a joy to write as well.
Yeah, and I love the doctor too.
Oh, Vicky was good. I did enjoy writing Vicky. She sort of pushes the envelope a little bit in terms of her medical ethics, but I don't think you could ever say she did the wrong thing. Yeah, she was fun to write. She was just a character who appeared, and I thought, oh, this is good. This is good. I used to listen to authors say that characters appear on the page by themselves, or characters make decisions about what to do or say things that the author doesn't expect. And I always used to think, oh, you're just saying that, but it actually does happen. Just the appearance of characters suddenly, and the types of personalities they have. That's definitely one of the great things about writing fiction, that you can just, anything that comes into your mind is a possibility. Doesn't mean you have to go with it, but it's one of the infinite possibilities you have.
I loved the way that you used the different timelines and points of view, particularly the contrast between Gwen in the 1940s and Joy in the 1960s. What I thought it did was it gave readers a glimpse into why Gwen was not the mother that Joy wanted her to be. And it also gave us an up-close and personal look at the destructive and silencing effects of domestic abuse and violence, the control that George exercised over his family by the use of violence. And the thing was that you didn't shy away from the detail and how appallingly frightened they all were of this man, who was, to all intents and purposes, a Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. So I wanted to ask you, was that hard? Did you find it hard to write these scenes?
Well, I'm actually going to say no, because even though logically it might sound that it would be hard to write these things, but I think there was something extraordinarily liberating for me to write those scenes.
Sure.
And I guess because I was drawing on experience, also I guess the experience of others who I know have had very difficult childhoods and sometimes relationships with intimate partners, that it seemed to come kind of easily. The psychologist might have a lot to say about that, I don't know. But it was easy to write those scenes. And there was a part of me that wanted people to understand what it was like to live in fear. Not that I really want people to experience it, of course, but I don't know. I think that everyone's had challenges in their lives. I completely understand that. And most people have things from their childhood that they might prefer had never happened. I have met in my life people who have said that things like their father beat them or strapped them or did this or did that. Sometimes also mothers, so it's not obviously exclusively something men do. But they basically said they had a happy childhood. And I had to unpack that a lot. And I realised that the difference was that in between the really bad stuff like belting a child, that some of those families had a lot of fun, but we didn't have a lot of fun. And we definitely lived with this sort of simmering fear all of the time that we would do something that was breaking a rule of some kind, and then we would be in trouble. And I think that simmering fear has a very long-lasting psychological effect on people. So I did kind of want people to understand that there are different childhoods, of course, we know that, but that these long-term ramifications are something a lot of people live with, and it does affect your self-confidence, and it does affect your belief that you can do certain things or that you're entitled, allowed to do certain things. So yeah, it is very dark in parts, and some of the episodes describing the violence or the aftermath of the violence are difficult to read, I know, but I think that if I had watered them down, I don't think the book would be as effective as it is. And I also don't think that all of the events, let's say, after that violence, so I guess moving into the 80s chapters, I don't think any of, and some of the things that happened later in the 60s chapters, I don't think they would have been as credible. It might have been, yeah, no, she wouldn't really do that. But if you have an extreme situation, you're going to have an extreme reaction. But I don't think those extreme reactions would have been, credible if the situation had been fairly ordinary.
I've spoken on this podcast before about the tendency of small communities to hide awful truths or to protect their own. But in this case, no one knew what her father was doing, and that if they knew, they would continue to pretend that George Henderson was a good man. You explored the dichotomy of who George was so effectively through the point of view of his family and the people who thought they knew him, the condolence notices that were printed in the paper after he died. And so often Joy and Gwen both heard people say that George was a good man, which annoyed me no end because it just made them think that they were the ones that were in the wrong, that they were the ones that had the problem. And yet I know that's not uncommon, is it?
Oh, it's so true. That is what they do. I just get outraged at this. And I'm sure a lot of us will remember what happened to Hannah Clark in Brisbane.
Yeah.
And people who said about her husband exactly that he was a good bloke. And this is, a phrase that people use all the time. He was a good bloke. Well, what is a good bloke? And I'm sure Hannah did not think he was a good bloke because she knew what he was like behind closed doors. And that's what a lot of people do. They are different people behind closed doors. And sometimes when people find out what they're like behind closed doors, I don't know whether they just refuse to believe it, or of course it's this sort of victim blaming thing that you touched on, Claudine, that it's, well, they must be the ones who have the problem. And it's that whole gaslighting and undermining of people's confidence, and that thing about, and well, now we have the word, that coercive control and emotional psychological abuse and so on, that in past eras we used to say, oh well, she must have provoked him, she must have done something wrong. And that idea that sometimes we kind of knew that women, and unfortunately of course it's not always women who are the victims, but we know that statistically they are more likely to be victims than perpetrators, that they're told by their intimate partners that they are useless, that they're no good at anything, that everything that they do is wrong, that they make poor decisions, that they're not able to, you know, hold down a job, or, you know, all of those things. And you know, you as the victim, you believe it. Eventually you believe it. And so Gwen did believe that she was not a good enough wife and never would be a good enough wife. And George, you know, in his own way was quite charming, of course, even to Gwen, well, obviously in their early days during their courtship, and even sometimes afterwards, which is, you know, there's that thing about messing with people's brains and their understanding of their own self-worth. You know, like when there's a point, this is not sort of revealing anything amazing, where he, early on in their marriage, he asks Gwen for all of her money to pay off, you know, a portion of the farm that they've bought. And Gwen doesn't even know if this is normal or not, and she agrees to do it. And George is very charming about it. But in essence, of course, now we read that and we realise that she has lost all financial independence and control. And she's, you know, she's only, I think she's 19 when she marries him. So, you know, and they've moved a long way away. She doesn't even know the region that they've moved to. She doesn't have family. And now she doesn't have any financial control or anything like that. And that stripping away of independence and self-determination and so on is so debilitating. So poor old Gwen, unfortunately, didn't stand a chance. And George is very clever, as many men are. And I want to say too, I read, I think it was on Goodreads when I was reading Goodreads reviews when the book first came out, and I read one that was not very complimentary. And the reader had said, I guess things like this happened in the 1960s, but they don't happen anymore. And I just thought, but yeah, do you not read the newspapers? Do you not listen to the news and see that women are still being physically, emotionally, financially, psychologically abused in all sorts of ways? And maybe we as a society frown on it a bit more, because certainly in the 1960s, and there's a scene where the parents of Joy's friends are talking about what's happened in the Henderson household. And there's this discussion about, look, a man is in charge, you know, of his own house. He can deal with things behind those closed doors however he wants to, because he's the head of the house. And that's really is what people believed. And we might not believe that quite so much anymore, but as long as, I'm going to say, men believe it, or as long as some people believe it, then they're going to act that out in their homes. And that's where the problems start, of course.
But as you say, it's not a problem that's been relegated to the past. It continues to be a problem. Women, despite having more agency and having more financial independence and more self-determination, lots of women are still falling victim to relationships where coercive control is a huge part of that relationship.
I think it's probably more rife than we believe. I have friends who, I think sometimes I look at their relationships and I think, I'm not particularly impressed with how you're dealing with this particular aspect of your shared life. You know, and then I find myself saying, oh, but it's none of my business. Well, it's none of my business, I guess, if they're both happy.
When does it become our business?
Yeah, I don't know. It's a really good question.
Lyn, slowly the reader comes to realise that Joy is an unreliable narrator, that she is deeply damaged by the violence her father inflicts not only on her but her mother and her brother. I wanted to ask you to tell me more about your decision to make this part of Joy's character.
I don't know that it was a conscious decision. I think it was one of those things that happens when you're writing, that you, particularly as you become more and more aware of how a reader is going to be coming to your writing and the structure of the novel. And I thought, well, I can't say up front everything that actually happens, or why it happens, or how it happens. So that means that you, as a writer, you have to find ways of telling your reader some things but hiding other things. And if you're going to describe a scene, then if you're an omniscient narrator, I guess you can see everything that happens and you can describe everything that happens. And if you're writing from a character's perspective, you're only going to be writing what that character sees. But then also the big thing is that then you can also decide what that character chooses to reveal. And so I think there's in some respects, you've got a bit more control, I guess, over what the reader is reading and what you can let them know and understand and see. But yeah, it became very obvious to me fairly quickly in terms of, well, when I say fairly quickly, once I reached that point where, right, I'm going to turn all of this into a novel, and it's going to be a novel that pulls people along. And so they wanted to keep finding out what happened next, or how did this happen, or why, and who and when, and all that sort of thing. Yeah, Joy had to become an unreliable narrator because there are things, but simply that I didn't want readers to know about until I wanted them to know about it. So you have to then create this perspective that you're in control of, and you sort of tightly hold the reins. I've talked about this before too, that when I was sort of quite close to, I'm going to say, finishing the first draft, so maybe, now maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I read Daphne du Maurier's Rebecca, which I had read before, but 30, 40 years ago maybe. And because I knew the twist of that story, when I was reading it, I became very aware of the brilliance that Daphne du Maurier had in writing sentences that have layers of meaning. But when you read it the first time, you take it up. You just take the literal in your face meaning, and you go along with what Daphne du Maurier is asking you to believe. And then, of course, when you learn the truth, you think, oh my God, I think it's worth reading. If you haven't read it, read it once and then almost straight away go back and read it again to see what she has done. It's really brilliant. And I really tried to tap into that and think, right, in 2018, I took a month off work and I worked literally every day, some days 13 hours, but every single day in that September on this novel. And I remember looking at dialogue and saying, okay, I want to do basically what Daphne du Maurier did. So I need to change this sentence. I need to put this word in. I need to say that. Or I need to use, in some cases, I just used a pronoun instead of a person's name. And so the reader thinks that it's Claudine, but it's actually referring to Lyn, or vice versa, or whatever I start. And I'm going to say that I was really, really dedicated or conscious about doing that. And so all of those, and I was surprised at how many times I'd read a sentence and think, right, that's giving away too much, or it's just giving away a little hint. And at this point, I don't want to yet do that. So I'm going to change what she says here, or change what she thinks, or think of a way of saying it where it can have two meanings. And it's only when you know the truth that you understand, it means this, not that. I enjoyed doing that a lot.
It's very clever. You're exactly right. When you're reading the book, you think it points to one conclusion, and then you realise that you've misread the clues. And it actually is something else entirely.
It's that you've taken a meaning, which is perfectly valid and perfectly, on one level, perfectly correct. It's just that, literally Joy has, or in some cases Ruth. I know there were a few times where I did it with Ruth as well, her sister. But I definitely wanted, in fact, the opposite to be true, but I had to think of a way of saying it that would make you think that X is the case when actually it's the opposite of X. So so it was fun sort of messing around with the language and how you could do that to come up with different words, hopefully without giving too much away. There's I'm going to say a play on words or something around the word dam. And as we speak, or very shortly, next month, the book comes out in Russian.
Oh.
And in a couple of months, it comes out in French. And I've been trying to work out what they're going to do with things like that.
Yeah.
And I've decided that I suspect they'll just delete that bit because they can't have the same play on words. It can't work in another language. So I kind of thought, oh, that's a bit of a shame.
Lyn, the setting of this book was also so skillfully depicted, I thought. It added to the very dark atmosphere of the story. It kind of really, really reflected the life that Joy and Gwen were living, I thought. But is it based on a real place? Did you have a particular geographic area in mind?
Yeah, look, essentially it's where I grew up, which was in the east of Victoria, where it's quite wet and damp. And a lot of people say it's beautiful because it has green rolling hills. And I can see how for some people it's beautiful, but for me it's not. And I lived for a while in my early 20s in the Wimmera in the northwest of Victoria, and that's flat and dry and red, and I absolutely loved it. So yeah, and essentially it is the farm that I grew up on in terms of its physical description and things like the dam and the rubbish tank and the house and even the flowers. So my mum was a florist. All of that was very easy to write. I made it a little bit more remote than my farm was, and I made the town a little bit smaller than the nearest town to our farm, because I think there's something about remoteness that means that secrets and lies can be hidden, and you get that very small town mentality of people sticking together and being cautious of different ways of thinking and so on. So that will work for me. But essentially it's set in a fictional town or outside of a fictional town. A few people have asked me, did you base it on X? And it's a town they know, and it might be in a really different part of Australia. So that's been interesting. A lot of people have said, oh no, I thought it must have been this town because it's what you described is exactly the way that this town is or was in the 60s and 70s. So essentially I just drew on my childhood memories.
Lyn, you might know that there are a lot of writers that listen to this podcast, and given your experiences and your great success with this book, I wondered if you had any tips to offer writers who might be listening in.
Oh, look, I don't know that I ever have anything original to say in this because so many, great books on writing, and we've had a few come out, a few great Australian, like Lee Kaufman and Charlotte Woods, of course, and so many others who write about this process of writing or explore it in podcasts or whatever. But one of the things that really made a difference for me was keeping track of the hours that I worked on my novel. So if I start at 9 o'clock in the morning, I will actually write down, it's the 28th of August or whatever it is, I'm starting at 9 o'clock, and then I might finish, stop at 12 o'clock and go and have lunch or do some other work or whatever I might do. And then I'm keeping track also of the number of hours I've worked. And I just think, well, if I only manage to do 2 hours a week, then I'm not really being serious about this novel. And of course it's not going to have progressed very much. Having only worked 2 hours a week will be kind of, for me, a bit of a kick in the ass. You're not going to write a novel if you only write 2 hours a week. And not only are you not going to write, it's going to take so long, you're not going to get immersed enough in it to have the quality of the writing that you need. And the other side of that is that if you write 25 hours one week or 40 hours one week, that's kind of really exciting and self-motivating. Yeah, this is great. I'm right into it and I can do it again. So that really worked for me. And I was lucky because I write for clients as my day job. I have to keep track of my hours for clients because I charge them on an hourly rate. And So I was already in the habit of doing that, and look, it works for me. But what it proves is you've got to have your bum on that seat. You've got to be at your desk writing. So I know it's stating the obvious, but I guess the other thing, based on my own experience, is you've got to push your doubts to one side. And I heard someone, they weren't talking about writing, they were just talking about life in general, this, inner critic that so many writers have, of course, especially, and other artists and so on, that if your inner critic was a real person and a friend of yours, you would actually stop being a friend. You would say, no, I don't need someone like that in my life, who is always telling me I'm not good enough, or always telling me I can't do it, or always telling me that what I've done isn't good enough. That you would actually get rid of that person. And I don't think it's entirely possible to get rid of them completely, but maybe you can just, when you're in your study, just say, you can just sit outside. Right now, I'm not letting any other friend or anybody else interrupt me, so I'm not letting you either. So I don't know how we find this self-belief if we don't have it. I think some people have it, and it's maybe been nurtured in them as a child, or maybe it's a genetic thing, I don't know. But if you don't have it, it's a really hard thing to find. But I think you just have to keep going and keep going and keep going, and share your work with other writers, so that they can say, I really love this, I love how you've done this, I love this character, I love this idea, I love this, whatever it might be, so that you're feeding yourself, or you're being fed with some positive feedback. Because I think that's, for me, that was so important. Yeah, as I said, people like Tony Birch and Arnold Zabel giving me positive feedback, and my friend Ken, just, for me, that was really important. That sort of changed my attitude and my self-belief.
Fantastic. Thank you. Two really terrific tips that I've not heard before. So, Lyn, you did mention that you were working on another book. I was wondering if you could tell us a little bit more about that.
Yep. So my contract with Penguin Random House says I am writing another compelling psychological literary thriller. So this is kind of good that I know that, because when I started writing The Silent Listener, I did not know that's what I was writing. So that's been really good. And I'm basing this also on true events, and it's about forced adoption during the 1960s. So this happened in America, and it happened all over as far as I know, sort of the Western world. In America, it became known as the baby scoop era, because there were childless couples literally kind of waiting to scoop up these babies pretty much the instant they were born to unmarried mothers. I have a friend who is one of those women in America in the 1960s. Every time I tell somebody that this is the basis of the story, everybody has a story that, their mother or their sister, or I just found out this morning from someone, weirdly, their first, their second wife, it happened to. They're older than me, and everyone has stories, or they were one of these babies, or their sister's husband was, or it's really amazing. There are thousands and thousands of people out there who were and are, I guess, the victims of policies and practices that meant that women who were not married when they were pregnant were often forced to go into these homes for unmarried mothers, forced to give up their children for adoption. And the aftermath of that is obviously terrible. And so I'm writing, another psychological thriller. So I've had to think about, okay, what would be happening in these situations where young women, and sometimes older women too, as in they weren't all teenagers, had to do this, and how can I make that into a psychological thriller? But I actually haven't had to even really think about how this would happen, because every time I do any research, and I've done a fair bit of research about it, which is talking to other people, but I've also read books and watched documentaries, and there are films like Philomena, which a lot of us have seen, that touch on this issue as well. Every time I think in the writing, I wonder if maybe I'll have this person do that so that this can't happen or that has to happen or whatever. And occasionally I've thought, I think that's a bit too far-fetched. But in my research, all of those things that I've thought, I don't think that would ever happen, have happened. And you hopefully when people are reading it, you will think, I just don't believe that this happened. But I'm telling you now, everything in this book has happened. I have not, I might have made it up in terms of this character. And one of the things that I've done is, I guess, combined a lot of things into one of those homes and the stories of one or two people. Maybe not all of these things happen to this one person, but all of these things have happened. And it is actually unbelievable and great fodder, unfortunately, great fodder for a psychological thriller, because the lies and the secrets are so outrageous. So I'm enjoying writing it too, because I guess I'm going to say I feel a great deal of sympathy towards, I'm going to say, the main character who's in one of these homes, I guess in the same way that I did towards Joy, because I know women this has happened to, and I've read about others, as there is in Silent Listener, a great deal of emotional truth. But there are twists, and again, I've got multiple timelines, multiple points of view. Don't know why I'm doing this. This is sort of a form of self-torture. I just feel compelled or drawn towards these sort of very complex, multi-layered stories. So it's been really, I don't know if fun is quite the right word to say. It's been fun to write, but I find it compelling to write, and I find I can really get immersed in it. And of course, hopefully that's what you want readers to experience as well.
So, Lyn, if listeners wanted to learn more about you and your book, our books, where can they find you?
I have a website, lynyeowart.com. I'm on Instagram and Twitter and Facebook, all basically Lyn Yeowart. I think there is only one Lyn Yeowart in the world, so it's very easy to find anything and everything about me. I've been loving readers commenting in, or contacting me on Instagram and Facebook and stuff like that. So if people want to do that, or want to share their experiences of reading, or their lives that may or may not have been similar to that depicted in The Silent Listener, I'm very welcome to hear about that sort of thing. And of course, if people just want to say they love the book, that's even the people want to hear from people that they enjoyed reading the book.
Fantastic. Well, Lyn, I really appreciated reading The Silent Listener. I thought it was a brilliant read, and I highly recommend it for lovers of psychological thrillers. Thank you so very much for joining me on Talking Aussie Books today.
It's been a pleasure, Claudine. You're a fantastic interviewer. I love your podcast, so I feel really honoured that I've been able to have a chat with you today. Thank you.
That's a wrap, folks. If you enjoyed this podcast episode, please drop me a line via my webpage at claudinetinellis.com, via Instagram, Facebook or Twitter. Alternatively, consider leaving a review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify or Google Podcasts. Until next time, happy reading.